Have you ever felt?
Are you listening? Damn. Yeah.
And the ball is loose. Third and 4.
Hey, so who you have three, man?
Yeah, I got my Bengals at number 3, and I think it starts with someone that not too many people talked about, but if you listen to some of the draft pundits, Joseph Asai, I think, is a guy that's really going to step in, especially with what Lou wants to do. We talk about dropping off into coverage. This is a former inside linebacker, and he shows some promise. So I think he's got some athleticism that we kind of have from Carl Lawson, and I think that he could really come into that role his rookie year. I think that he could be a guy that could potentially get you 4 or 5 sacks just built off of his athleticism and his motor, and he's a guy that just doesn't quit when it comes to that. And him having those linebacker skills, I think that adds another flexible option for him. Then you talk about Khalid Kareem, one of my good friends that I interviewed on the podcast. I went back and watched some of the Bengals games. Although you look at his sack numbers, they're not super eye-popping because he was a rookie last year. He was playing with an injury, but he was around the quarterback early and often. There was one play he almost got Lamar Jackson in the backfield, and that's a tall task for anybody to try to get Lamar Jackson in the open field. But he had plenty of times where he could have got that sack. I was actually texting him during the season. And the one that he actually got his sack, I kept saying, I almost saw you last week, almost get a guy, bro. And we talk about pressures and stuff like that, right? And even when you look at his PFF grade, they were very solid. He's actually one of my sleepers, I think, going into the season in that reserve role behind Sam Hubbard. So Khalid Kareem is a guy that I really liked coming out of Notre Dame. I think we even kind of talked about it on this show after the draft. And then you also talk about Sam Hubbard. Sam Hubbard, to me, he's just the epitome of a solid guy. Not sure if he's exactly like what you're looking for from a starting standpoint, but he can be a Robin. He can get you 7 to 8 sacks potentially at his best. I don't think that he's a guy that can get you double-digit sacks or 10 to 12. I think that that's pretty much his role. And then you talk about some of the guys that they had last year. Obviously, this team finished with 17 sacks, but they had guys like Amani Bledsoe out there at points. And once they got rid of Carlos Dunlap, they just really didn't have anyone. So that was definitely something that they looked into this offseason. They had Carl Lawson, but Carl Lawson, since he was the best edge rusher, teams just pretty much focused on him. And he had, even in a contract year, he didn't give you the sack total that you want. He's getting the pressures like Tony likes and that people like, but he didn't give the sacks that you would like to see from a guy who was really ascending. You talk about a guy that his rookie season had more sacks than Myles Garrett. So you're thinking that the sky is the limit, and eventually this guy is going to have a season where he had at least 10 sacks. He didn't have that. I'm not going to say that that's not possible in New York. But that's just the reality of what last season was when you look at it from just a sack perspective. And then you talk about the big ticket guy that they brought in with Trey Hendrickson. Now, a lot of people are pretty much finding any kind of reason to discredit the man having 13 and a half sacks. And I get it, right? Because, obviously he plays with Cam Jordan. So obviously teams are going to focus on Jordan. And yes, he did have cleanup sacks and stuff like that. But when I cut the tape on this guy, he was beating good tackles. Like, it wasn't like he was going against bums and stuff like that when he was matched up against these guys. He simply was beating them. But when I look at it from that perspective, Carl Lawson's way more athletic. He's probably he probably is a better edge rusher, right? But if Carl Lawson gave you 5.5 sacks last year and this guy gives you 9 or 10, some people are going to look at that and say that was an upgrade over Carl Lawson, who only gave you 5.5 sacks. Now, he might not give you as many pressures, but I think that there's a lot of people just looking for any reason to discredit this guy when there's been guys like Shaq Lawson, who nobody was talking about 2 years ago, that the Bengals, our fan base is up in arms about that, because we originally had a deal on the table to sign him for $4 million a year 2 years ago. And the Bengals didn't end up pursuing the deal because there was some kind of reported injury issue with him. He goes to the Bucs and then he ends up with 19 sacks. So I think, given that situation, I'm not saying he's going to go out and get 9 or 19 sacks or anything like that, but I don't think it's far-fetched to say that this guy Hendrickson could get 9 to 10 sacks just based off of some of the stuff he learned last year. Now, that all depends on the scheme, how he fits and everything like that. but I can't doubt a guy that had 13 and a half sacks. Now, if I paid a whole bunch of money to a guy like Carl Lawson on the flip side of things, like New York did, and he only had 5.5 sacks, and he's the main guy in New York, and we saw how he played without a Carlos Dunlap across from him, I think I have more questions about it. The other part of it is a lot of people look at the money that the Bengals gave Hendrickson, but the thing is they could get out of the deal in 2 years if they really want to. But at the end of the day, for me, I think that the Bengals, they have more guys that I can kind of depend on other than the Ravens. Not as many as the Browns or the Steelers, but I at least have some guys that I feel like have potential there. And when we talk about edge, I'm completely talking about just the edge position, not saying that, I'm not talking about blitzing linebackers. And that's what I kind of said on the first argument that I made. So this is purely for me just on the edge position. And so that's why I have to rank the Bengals third.